Welcome to Coastal Front. Join us each week as we sit down with the movers and shakers of Vancouver to discuss stories of business, politics, accomplishment, and failure. Our aim is to keep you dialed into what matters most in our city. Now, here's your host, Andrew Johns.
All right, here we go. Tom Davidoff, associate professor at the business school, Sauder Business School of UBC.
Yep.
I think I got that right.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, Tom. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Really happy to have you here today.
A real pleasure. Thanks for doing this.
You and I have got to know each other over the last couple of years, and we had some great conversation by way of personal dialogue as well as over Twitter. And I really support a lot of the thought ideas that you've come up with over the years. And we actually first met when you and a few other fellow professors wrote that piece. I forget what you call it now. It was the
BC Housing Affordability Fund.
Yeah,
because
BC
people like funds better than taxes.
Yeah, right.
Government should have thought of that.
Yeah. And you actually wrote that back before the election, before it was way back, was it 2015, was it?
Yeah, we did a piece pretty similar to that. Soar Somerville, Sang Hoon Lee, and I wrote a letter to Christy Clark, who was in power at the time. And, she said, okay. I mean, she did. I mean, we got the ultimate whatever dudes form letter. And, then I noticed around the block we had David Eby, an MLA, who was the housing critic, who seemed to be very on this outside money in the housing market. So I was expecting the same thing from him, like, whatever, I don't care, I'm an MLA and you're a constituent, so, whatever. But that was really the opposite. We had a meeting and so he said maybe write a white paper, get some other people to sign off on it, and away we went.
Yeah. Now, David's great. And you actually had, after you guys finalized that paper, you had sign off from a lot of professors at the three major universities in BC, did you not?
Yeah, and let's take a step back and talk about what it is. And, the speculation tax, of course, is controversial, but I think the fundamental idea we had was not. So I did years ago a paper with my old grad school friend Saku Aura, which we thought was mostly esoteric on property taxes. And we had a hunch that we could say, governments rely on this weird thing, the property tax, a lot. Local governments, not federal governments so much, but local governments do. And it's a weird tax because it taxes two things at once at the same rate. And one of them is structures. You build a nice house, every dollar of nice you put in gets taxed. And that seems kind of questionable because, of course, then you say, well, geez, maybe I don't want to, if I'm going to face high property taxes, maybe I don't want to make such a nice house. And then you're just screwing up people's choices to build homes. On the other hand, taxing the land, since David Ricardo, people talk about Henry George, the economist, but David Ricardo, years, 200 years ago, whatever, 300, whatever it was, said, well, wait a second, land, that's free money because, you can't make the land any worse. So, it's weird to tax the two at the same rate. That's the convention. So then we just had a conjecture, which probably should have been easier to prove for us than it was for us coming out of grad school, which was markets where it's harder to add building and where land is a bigger part of value should be the markets where you have higher property taxes. And so I always thought, when I got to Vancouver, I was like, I think things are a little out of whack here. I think we ought to have higher property taxes, lower other taxes, because a lot of the value is land. And, relative to the States, Canada, for probably some good reasons.
Just for reference, Tom, when was it you came to Vancouver?
I came to Vancouver in 2009.
2009.
So It's funny because I got here when I was sort of on the job market, and I was like, this is a quiet, mellow place. Everybody's been very interested in housing in the States. Maybe that's gotten in the way of my research productivity because I've been all interested in policy. I'm going to get here, peaceful, sleepy town, locking myself in an office, do esoteric research nobody cares about. It's okay. I'll be out of the limelight and do research. And it turned out to be very different. Anyway, so the idea I've always had was, well, you should raise property taxes, cut income and sales taxes. But that's a non-starter. I mean, you can't go to any legislator who can win an election knows that that's a total loser. The voting is dominated by homeowners north of 55. And if you're a homeowner, north of 55, you've paid off the house by working all your life. A cut in the income tax does you a little bit of good for a short time. A property tax is a double whammy because it kills your property value and it's money out of your pocket. So you're never going to get a majority of the electorate on a giant tax reform that changes the rules of the game when people are midstream. But then we start reading about E.B. and Kathy Tomlinson, the Globe reporter, going after this idea of empty homes, that there's money coming in from outside. And I said, wait a second, here's an opportunity to sort of kill two birds with one stone. So people are freaked out that locals are getting priced out. And maybe we can do tax reform this way. So the natural thought was, well, if you live and work here, okay, fine, I don't like the property tax system, but you're an incumbent, you're working here, you're paying taxes, you get to play by the old set of rules. But if you're going to buy a property here and not be part of the high income taxes, well, you're going to have to cough up higher property taxes. So you get a step in the direction of a better tax system, and you handle this issue of outside money. And so it's that rare case where you change taxes in a way that makes things more efficient. You have a better, more dynamic economy because you're taking the tax burden off making a living and doing stuff, and you're shifting it to owning property in Vancouver, which everybody wants to do anyway, with or without a tax. You're just going to change the price. So you're both shifting resources from people who are mostly affluent towards those who are not, but that usually screws up the economy. Here we have a case where you actually probably make the economy better and more dynamic. So I think that was almost a no-brainer, that one, for most economists, and that's why we were able to get so much support from the UBC and Simon Fraser economists.
And when you guys completed that housing affordability fund, is what you call it, if I recall, you actually got invited over to Victoria to present this, did you not? To Christy Clark's government at the time?
I think there was some support. I think they knew they had to do something. And by 15, 16, things were getting so nutty.
They were.
And that was the election. I mean, I think they saw the election coming. They said, we have to do something.
Yeah.
And I think there were probably multiple ideas on the table. And I think they went with the simplest one. What I just described is a little complicated.
The simplest one was, just to be sure, what you're talking about, it was the foreign home buyers.
That's right. Let me see your passport.
Yeah.
Canadian, fine, good. PR, good. Nope, not you.
Yeah.
That's a Chinese passport. That's an American passport.
Yeah.
Not the same. So you're going to pay the tax. That's very easy to implement.
Because I remember David and I having a pretty lengthy conversation about this and saying, like, this doesn't at all really address the issue. And in fact, it had some really negative consequences in the sense of you had people maybe like yourself who weren't residents of Canada, talented professors coming from, say, the United States to come live here, and you bought a place, and all of a sudden you're getting hit with I think at the time, 20% or 15%?
Yeah, I think we did have even a Sauder professor who might have got. They subsequently took it off for work permit, but then you get away from the simplicity.
That's right.
Right? You have this blunt instrument, and you're going to have type 1 and type 2 errors. You're going to tax people who shouldn't get taxed, and you're going to not tax people who should get taxed. So then you start messing with the foreign buyer tax and say, oh, we'll allow work permit. But then the beautiful simplicity's gone. And
so if you're going to have something more complex, make it better anyways. I mean, the way I see it is, my big criticism from the start was that, well, what happens to all the people who bought a house that were foreign buyers the year before, or the year before that, or the year before that? They're exempt from that tax, and so they can sit there with an empty home. That's why I've always been very supportive of your guys' affordability fund. I read it; it made so much sense. I'm a little bit disappointed. I'll speak my own view here, but I'm a little disappointed at the way that they've rolled out the speculation tax. There's been some real major errors. Like the residents of Belcarra are getting hit hard. I talked to Neil Belenky, who's the mayor there. I'm going to hopefully have him on the show, talk about that. And also the other thing that I'm personally frustrated with is that there's got to be, I don't know anybody personally, but there's got to be people who are affected that have been long-time taxpayers here in Canada, probably affluent, but they've paid their fair share of taxes, if not more. Yet they might have a house in West Vancouver, West Side Vancouver, with a condo downtown that they like to use for social engagements, whatever it might be, or they have a place over on Vancouver Island, maybe in Nanaimo or in Kelowna. There are definitely people who have a summer house in Kelowna, and they have a home in Vancouver, and they've paid years of taxes, and now they're getting hit with this massive tax because they either have to rent out their place in Kelowna, which they may not want to do, or they have to just accept the fact that they're not speculators. In some cases, they've owned these houses for years. Well,
speculation tax is a funny name. I mean, in fact, I'll tell you the story of this. Budget day was coming, And I knew, they were sort of, we're going to do something about speculation. I was like, gosh darn it, I thought they were going to do my plan. I put a lot of time and blood, sweat, and tears into the, well, no blood, but, sweat and sweat.
Yeah.
Effort.
Tears
no blood,
tears
no blood, no
after
sweat, no tears. But, you know what I mean.
Got it, yeah.
I put something, a lot of time,
Yeah.
which is, my advisor pointed out to me in grad school, as an economist, as a researcher, you have one asset, and that's your time. And I put a lot into it. And I thought, I thought this was coming. It's not. Oh, well, next, because it was a speculation tax. So, no, I don't think if you have a second home, you're a speculator. Now, we can agree to disagree on this. I think a primary home is where the taxes ought to be eased off. With secondary homes, where I think the NDP started off on dicey terrain, and, I think they've probably gone towards reasonable, is where should this tax be applied? Extra property tax because you want to encourage people to make a living in a city. Almost nobody complained to me, hey, I have a second home in Cole Harbor and it's not fair that I have to pay. Nobody has said that because I think everybody realizes, city of Vancouver, you might want to make that affordable for people who actually are trying to get one home.
Sure.
You don't have, sure, there might be a second homelessness problem, but let's deal with the homelessness problem first.
Yeah.
But then when you get to a place that's a cabin in the woods, there is no issue of local housing affordability, and the economy relies on tourism. So
fair enough. I mean, I could see the validity behind, taxing some affluent family or individuals who want to own two residences in a place like Vancouver where there is a real affordability issue. I'm not sure there's an affordability issue in Kelowna. I don't know. I'd have to probably.
Well, Kelowna is an interesting case, I think. I think it's really, obviously they rely on the vacation and tourism industry.
Yeah.
And a tax like this that says we don't want people from outside buying property could affect that economy. On the other hand, I was sort of surprised. I talked to a guy who comes around UBC and buys and sells books, and he was struggling to be able to afford a place in Kelowna. They really are actually apparently having a live and work problem. Now, when we devised the program, it was different in that this was going to be opt-in by municipalities.
Sure.
And if the municipality wanted to opt in, they got to keep the revenue and spend it how they wanted
That's
locally.
one of the things I really liked about your guys' policy is that you let the decision making, you set the policy at the provincial level and you make it something that's a provincial tax or administered, but the municipal government gets to decide, which they have a far more intimate, that's where a town like a village like Belcarra could say, we opt out.
Yep.
This is not in the best interest of the local residences. And then equally, if you do have a community, and also what's nice about it is that the situation that today in BC and these communities that this is applied to might not be the same situation a decade from now or 2 decades from now.
Yeah.
And so if you leave it up to the municipal government, then you can kind of have this in place indefinitely and allow the local government to really make that decision. I mean, personally, I think it's a smart idea.
Yeah, I like that approach. You can certainly understand if you're a finance minister for a province wanting to say, yeah, that model where the municipality keeps the money is one thing, but we like the model where the province keeps the money. Of course, you one understands the incentive.
Well,
but
it's
when
kind
you
of
do
like
it
the
that
education
way,
tax, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they call this additional. If your house is valued over $3 million, you're now paying, or is it called a school tax?
School tax.
Oh, school tax.
Yeah.
But there's no requirement at all by the provincial government to put that towards schools. It's just going to general revenue.
Well, that goes to why we called the BC Housing Affordability Fund a fund instead of a tax. And for economists, we generally would say, now it's complicated because a lot of people don't trust the government. But if you think the government's game is we're trying to make people as well off as possible, but we care about the bottom of the income distribution and we need bridges and schools, there's a balancing act. You want to raise revenue from taxes to do the good stuff, like build bridges and have good schools. But at the same time, you don't want to take too much money from people, and you want to be surgical about where you have the taxes so that you don't screw up the economy with taxes. You tax the stuff that you're not creating distortion. You just cough up the money and you're done. If you believe that, then it really doesn't matter where the revenue from a particular tax goes. So we get this with the carbon tax. Oh my God, this is terrible. You're raising gas taxes, and it used to be that the money went and you wrote a check to every household, or you wrote some document that says now income taxes are going to be cut by the same amount. Within a budget, ultimately money's fungible. If there's more money coming into the government, there's more capacity for spending. If there's less money coming into the government, there's less capacity for spending. And if you force me to spend all the money from one tax on schools, well, now I've hit how much I want to spend on schools. I'm going to spend less on schools from the other taxes than I would have otherwise. So this targeting has a lot of appeal, but I think that's more of a political than a policy thing.
Sure. Well, on that political point, going back to Kelowna, I actually think a big reason why Kelowna was included and kept in versus certain communities like Whistler were excluded is because Kelowna is like the hotbed for the BC Liberal government.
I think it was Christy Clark's seat, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So it has been for many years. And I don't know if you remember, but when they originally went to roll out the speculation tax, they actually had 3 levels. So they had if you were a BC resident,
yep,
if you were a Canadian but non-BC resident, or if you were a foreigner. And it's interesting because Andrew Weaver was the MLA who basically said, no, we have 2 models. You either are a Canadian or you're non-Canadian. So it's for me, it's kind of ironic that the head of the Green Party literally helped save money to the oil workers from Alberta who own a vacation home in Kelowna. I mean, that's just the irony of this, right? I mean, I don't think that was...
I got a lot of correspondence on that.
Did you?
Yeah. I got a couple of Vancouver Island or the Gulf Islands. I don't understand this is a place in the woods. I got a lot of, hey, I'm a, successful guy from Alberta. I do vacation in Kelowna. That was the number one. It's funny. I mean,
true.
I'm not in charge of anything, but I got a lot of correspondence on this. And what was really striking was I got a lot of Kelowna, a little bit of Gulf Island, and 0 Vancouver. Nobody contacted me and said, hey, I have a pied-à-terre downtown and a house in West Van. Right. This is baloney. And I think the issue is that I'm sure people are upset by that, and I'm sure that exists. And I think there is a case for, hey, I pay income taxes, the second home ought to be excluded.
Yeah.
That's a discussion one can have. But I think people understand there's limited sympathy for, hey, I've got a pied-à-terre in Cole Harbour, and it's not fair I'm paying tax. But I think people said, geez, what are you doing? Come on, I'm willing to pay taxes, but I don't get Kelowna. I think, the sympathy there, I can see it more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the decision of what communities are included and which ones aren't, in my view, is largely more political than it is a basis on affordability. Because again, why is Whistler excluded but Kelowna is not? Why is Belcarra included but Lions Bay is not? Why is Nanaimo included but not Parksville? So it's interesting to see how these decisions were made. One of the things I want to talk to you about, and I'm sure you got lots of items on your list, but one of the other things that I thought was interesting in these tax changes was the increase on taxes of property transfer tax.
Yeah.
And a good friend of mine, Mike Ramph, was on a show a couple of weeks ago. He's a realtor here in town. Do you know Mike?
Well, yeah, I do. His partner, Sean Anderson, I've worked with, and he's a Sauder alum.
Oh, okay.
So,
Sean's great.
Anderson Ramph.
Yeah.
Great for your housing needs. There's a lot of great realtors in town.
No, there are lots.
But there are 2 of them.
There are 2 of them for sure. And so we were talking about this property transfer tax, and we were talking about how basically, as a realtor, generally realtors, and my dad was a realtor for years, so I'm quite familiar with. So realtors generally, they don't care about where the prices go. They just want turnover because they don't make. I mean, sure, granted, they make a higher percentage of prices go up, but a smart realtor would much rather have a high turnover market with falling prices than a low turnover market with rising prices.
And that's one of the interesting things about the agency contract that's a problem, because of course, agents are always saying the seller's such a knucklehead. I'm telling him you're not going to get $4 million for that house. If you want to sell it, drop the price down to $3.5 million. Unfortunately, the seller is aware, A, the realtor knows better than I do the market, so I should listen. But on the other hand, this guy just wants to get the deal done, so I shouldn't listen.
Yeah.
And that's attention. But yes, absolutely. Turnover, volume is the game for sure.
Yeah. And if you look at the revenue lines of revenue from the provincial government, one of the major ones in the last number of years has been revenue from property transfer tax.
Of course.
And ironically, in the same theme, the provincial government depends on turnover.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I've been somewhat critical of is So they increased the property transfer tax for values of homes above a certain dollar. I can't remember what it was, but in the millions.
I think I think Christy Clark did a progressive one, and then part of the additional school tax was even more, north of $3 million.
Well, the school tax is an annual tax.
That's right. No, but it included a bump in the property transfer tax.
Right. Okay. Yes. So that's right. So you've got a school tax that applies to two things. One is your annual cost of having a house over $3 million, but also if that house is sold, then there's a higher percentage. And my my view is you should almost have an incentivized model for these, ultra expensive homes, $5 million involved. That says your property transfer tax is whatever the percentage is, 4%. But if you sell your house within 24 months of buying it, it'll only be 2%, because then you get turnover. And in a way, you almost encourage speculation at the highest end, because by getting the rich people out there to speculate and turn over their houses, you're generating more activity, which means you're generating more tax, which accomplishes the goal of putting money back into the coffers of the government to pay for more affordable housing. Because the reality is, a house that goes from $5 million to $7 million to $6 million to $8 million to $4 million will never be affordable for anybody other than the wealthy. Is that a fair idea?
I think there's a lot to what you're saying. And the first thing that's very interesting about politics is economists hate property transfer tax generally.
Okay.
Because it is a property tax, right? If when you ultimately sell your house, you're going to have to pay a transfer tax on it. Oh, wait a second, you're not going to pay. The next buyer is. But either way, that's diminishing the value of your property to you because the buyer is willing to pay less because of the property transfer tax. So you're whacking the value of a home. Well, that's what a property tax does. So why not do it with a property tax? Because the difference is a property tax, whoever owns the house is going to pay the tax no matter what. A property transfer tax is just a property tax that also punishes you for selling the house. And, do people sell houses too much, too little? I don't know. It's nice to have a stable community, but as you mentioned, but it's also nice for people to move for jobs efficiently. So punishing people for moving is a bad idea, A, but B, if there's a property transfer tax, then of course, as you say, the government wants people to keep churning. So that's point one. Point two is you raise a couple of points about, in a way, the top of the market just exists as a tax farm. If you're well off enough to have a $5 million, $8 million house, I think the government's attitude is basically, that's great. Thank you for being such a successful person. You're now one less person to worry about. You're going to be fine, and you exist to hand over revenue. I think that's inevitably what the government sees. And, I think ideally you look at that, you say, hey, I've made success, and I'm proud that I am now, a farm. You don't want to be victimized. You don't want to be have the rules changed in the middle of the game, and of course, you don't want to scare people off from success. Because even if you just want to exploit the high ability or the lucky or whatever makes people rich, you don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Even if you don't care about these people at all. And in that sense, the top of the market, in the very top, the luxury stuff, that new neighborhood in West Van, whatever it's called, you're not trying to make it affordable with tax policy. You're trying to maximize tax revenue. And to the extent you kill that, that's a dicey proposition. For example, I believe the foreign buyer tax may and people don't know this, I think the foreign buyer tax may have been revenue negative.
Oh, I think so.
Wrong side of the Laffer curve.
Yeah.
Now,
because I talked about this with Mike.
Yeah.
I said, if you totally scare off these foreign investors, especially the ones that are buying the $20 and $30 million homes, because when we talked about this in our podcast, we kind of ran the math on just a simple $5 or $10 million house.
Yes.
And the cost for a wealthy individual from mainland China or some other country who would want to bring their money. No, candidly, they're probably bringing it here to kind of harbor it and safeguard it, because it's a pretty safe place. It's away from hyperinflation and onerous taxes issue or whatever issue.
Theft by the government.
Yeah, exactly. But if you scare those people away, because now if you're going to buy, if you're a foreign buyer come to this market and you're buying a $10 million house, it's going to cost you somewhere north of $2 million right off the top.
Yeah, and then every year if you don't live there,
Absolutely. Now you're waiting 15, 20 years just to recover your money.
Yeah.
But if you made that tax still high enough to make it meaningful, but not so much to discourage these people from coming, I look and go, hey, you know what? The reality is a $10 or $50 million house will never be affordable for anybody. Even if it drops, a $10 million house that drops by 70% in value is still a $3 million house. Yeah. The average Joe is not going to be able to pay for that. But in the meantime, you can capture a lot. It's like you said, a tax farm. I love that terminology, a tax farm. Yeah. I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot by saying this because I live in those kind of areas. I'm not to that extreme, but it's and I can appreciate what you're talking about. But I also look at it and go, hey, you know what? These people are coming over this country. They want to spend that kind of money. Let them spend it and tax them enough to keep the cash flow going.
Yeah, a couple of remarks on that. It may be that you want to get rid of the bad behavior. So, for example, some people criticize carbon taxes as saying, well, they don't change anybody's behavior. In some way, you say, well, good, it's free money then. You can lower the other taxes, you get the revenue without distortion. But I think with some of these taxes, the goal is to get homes into the hands of locals. So you measure success arguably by no more transactions. Where that becomes hard to swallow, I think what you're saying is at the high end because, come on.
Yeah, set a threshold, like say anything above $3 million or $5 million.
Right. Yeah.
Let the bad behavior continue at the top end because they're never going to be affordable anyways, and at least you can generate tax revenue from it.
I mostly find a lot to agree with in that. Where I have one bit of disagreement is on the north of $3 million homes tax, there's an incentive that I don't think any politician would ever cop to, but that I think is a terrific one, which is one way out of paying a tax. Say you got a $6 million house on a quarter acre or whatever, chop it up into $8 million units. And now none of them pay any tax. And you get more value for your property. Now, the trade-off is if you permit yourself to do that, you're permitting your neighbor to, and there goes the neighborhood. You lived in beautiful single-family homes, and now it's townhomes, which is not so great. But your house is worth a couple $1 million more. So we see that political balance playing out throughout Vancouver, and it's a difficult one. And, I believe the underzoning of Vancouver is one of the culprits in the high price of housing here. And that does shift the politics because you think, geez, do I really want to go yell against that guy's townhome project at the community meeting? Because if I do, that's my right as well. And now with the tax, I have an additional incentive. So,
Yeah.
It's 3D chess, but the point remains, you have to be careful in taxation not to kill the goose that lays the golden egg.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about your Housing Affordability Fund because there was another feature about that I want to discuss that I think is really important. A lot of people should hear about because I think it was really smart and it was missed out in this new speculation tax that the provincial government brought in. And I'm sure you got lots of other neat things to talk about as well. So let's take a quick break and we'll come back with Tom Davidoff.
Pictures.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we're back here with Tom Davidoff, Associate Professor at the Sauder School of Business at UBC, talking about real estate policy in Vancouver and the BC market. Tom, you guys, we're going back to talking about your housing affordability fund. And one of the things I liked about that fund that I feel like the current policies of the current government have missed is on taxing those people in the province. And I always like to call it the sort of the drug dealer tax, because candidly, there was a guy, as I told you about, that lived in our building who was a pretty notorious drug dealer. And sadly, I had to live near this guy. Yeah. He's not around anymore, which is probably good for everybody. But he actually had this $4.3 million condo in the building. It was like 3-4 units combined. And I'm pretty sure the guy never paid the amount of tax he should have paid to pay for this thing in the first place. And I believe your affordability fund would have captured that type of environment where whether it was someone was a drug dealer or someone was just doing a lot of business under the table or just not paying what I would describe paying their fair share of taxes to be able to afford that kind of asset. Is that fair that your policy was going to address something like that?
Oh, yeah, very much so. So it had nothing to do with what your passport says. And it wasn't, you had one address from which you pay your income tax. So when you pay your income tax, from which address are you paying that? If that's the primary residence, that's where you live to work, you get to declare all the income tax you pay as a dollar for dollar credit against this bump in property tax.
Right.
So unless you've lived in the property a long time, we just said, because long-term residents, you've been there for 10 years, the market's gone up. you bought based on a $30,000 income that just isn't going to support the new property tax, we gave you a pass for long-term residency.
Sure.
Seniors just off the hook, got to do it. But otherwise, there's only two ways you're out of the tax. Number one, this is where you live and work, and you get credits for income tax you actually pay. So undeclared drug income, it wouldn't work. Right. The other one would be rental income.
And probably declared drug income probably wouldn't work for you either.
Well, that's the beauty. Of course, it would discourage naughty behavior. It would encourage people starting to claim sweet income, for example, which is another one.
Right.
Because the other way you get a credit is gross rental income that you declare to CRA.
Sure.
And it had to be gross. We wanted to do net. But the problem is net rent divided by price could be less than property tax after you take out mortgage and depreciation and property taxes. So it had to be gross. But then again, you encourage people now to be honest about their sources of income. And if it is a case of a satellite family from overseas, as I understand it, there's some ambiguity. If I work in Mexico City and my family is here in Vancouver, do I have to declare myself a resident for tax purposes of Canada? My understanding is that's gray area, and I would now have an incentive to go over the line and start paying that tax. Of course, I'd also have an incentive to get out of the property, but I'd have an incentive to start declaring income tax here. And of course, that's a good thing for people who live here.
And would that policy that you had thinking about you're not taxed based on your passport, but based on the taxes you pay? Let's take a scenario where, let's say, you are a foreigner, you own a real nice house in Vancouver, but you also have built a business in Vancouver. And while you may not personally pay income tax in Vancouver because it's not your primary residence, you employ 15 or 20 people and your company pays a lot of taxes. Would it address that in any way?
No.
Okay.
No, you'd be on the hook if you're not declaring it. The way we wrote it, you wouldn't. But of course, exactly how you should treat corporations would be an implementation question. And I think you're raising a valid point. If you have a lot of investments here, maybe you ought to get credit for that as well, even if it is a pied-à-terre.
Yeah. I just like the theme or the thought that, look, if you're paying taxes in this country, whether you're a resident or not, you're adding to the tax roll for the government to be able to afford things like supporting affordable homes and low-income housing, then you shouldn't be penalized in addition. And then equally, if you are a local, you're born and raised here, but you're skirting the system and by one means or another, now you're going to pay if you're going to be able to afford to buy a nice place with no declared income.
Well, another one would be, and this is a politically interesting one because I think there's more sympathy for this than you might think, which is you have a successful parent and they leave you enough money or gift you while they're alive to give you the down payment and help with the mortgage, and you're a yachtsman or a poet who doesn't ever get the poems published, but that's what you do with your time. Again, you'd be subject to that tax as well. Your primary residence, you're not paying tax enough to support that purchase. You live in a fancy home.
Yeah.
I don't know politically how that would play. If you look in the U.S. where we have estate taxes, here we don't. In the U.S. they've managed to turn the estate tax into a tax on poor, struggling farmers, which it is absolutely not. But people really don't like the idea of estate tax. Other people might think, geez, you inherited money and you live in a fancy house. That I don't see why you shouldn't pay extra tax. But that would be another case. Drug dealer, heir to a fortune.
Yeah,
a lot of Canadian uses potentially.
Yeah, sure. Now you've written a few pieces, and we'll pull this up on the screen here. That a couple of sort of comments that you want to discuss on the title of this: some interventions that we might expect with respect to this is to do with the speculation tax.
Yeah. So if we look at the bullet points on the first page, and then we can look at a picture together. For those of you looking at video, there's been a lot of interventions into the market. And, some people want to say it's all the foreign buyer tax. That's what solved the problem. Some people want to say, no, you had to have the speculation tax, or it's the empty homes tax in Vancouver. Other people say these taxes have been totally ineffective. The only thing that mattered was the stress test. it's a little bit hard to disentangle.
The stress test for mortgages.
The stress test, yeah. Let's be clear about what that was. There was stress test 1 and stress test 2. Okay. In late 2016, effective 2017, the Fed said if you're going to take north of 80% LTV, so your mortgage, if it's through one of the regulated banks, has to carry mortgage insurance. If we're going to give you mortgage insurance, you have to qualify
and just
to
be
make
clear,
payments.
This is CMHC mortgages.
CMHC or Genworth can compete with them, but
right.
the standard product that has to be purchased by the bank if they're going to lend to you more than 80% of the property value. If that's going to be issued, you have to qualify not at today's low interest rates, but if rates rise by 2%, you still have to be not paying more than 32% of your income. And so if you're stressed by higher interest rates, can you still make the payments? People thought that would have a big impact. I was at a housing conference, and everybody was like, oh boy, this is going to be a killer. And from 2016 to 2017, if you go to the chart, what you'll see is it's a little tough to read, but you see a yellow line, that's the price of single family homes. The blue and green lines are the average price and the price of condos. And after mid-2016, after that giant spike in the yellow, which happens to be when the foreign buyer tax was brought in, that's it for the growth in single family. It treaded water for a while, fell right after the tax, bopped up, but it hasn't seen any more growth. And as everybody knows, it's starting to tick down. Condos went nuts after foreign buyer tax. They're up about 30% from where they were by mid-2018 relative to foreign buyer tax.
Why is that?
Well, that's a great question. And it's an even better question when you ask the stress test. Stress test 1 seems to have had, maybe it had an effect, maybe the prices would have been up 50%, but it's awfully hard to look at that picture with the spike in condo after 2016 and say, great work with the stress test. Things have calmed down starting around mid-2018 in the condo market, and that's when stress test 2, which was announced in late 2017, started to bite because, people still qualify, use mortgages that qualified under the old rules. But late 2017, stress test 2 comes in, and that's everything the banks do. That's under 80%, whatever. I think what happened, probably why stress test 1 didn't work, if I had to point a finger, because there were a lot of first-time buyers in the market influencing the market, and I'll show you some evidence for that. I think they were switching to 20% down loans, but the question is, well, how? I mean, first-time buyer, that's a heavy lift. Sure. I mean, $1 million condo, that's $200K. And I think we both know, when you're around the age of first-time buyer, assembling $200K, that's a big ask. That's not everybody. No. There's a lot of very skilled, hardworking people.
Even with mom and dad throwing 50 or 100 grand in.
You inherit something, you still, that's a heavy lift. So how were so many people all of a sudden able to acquire that down payment? I think it was second loans. And, the banks, how they're supposed to look at second loans, I think there's some ambiguity. I think there's some ambiguity in the behavior. So when they extended it to all loans, there was no longer the incentive. You couldn't get around this by adding more debt on. And I think the banks were sort of chastised to not do that. But if you look at the bottom picture, what you see is you ask, how did prices jump so high? Little hard to tell, but there's a blue line that spikes around peaks, I should say, not spikes, around 2016, just when prices do. You see that thin blue line?
Yeah.
That plummets. And what that picture is...
What is the blue line?
The blue line is... The green line is like for a typical condo, how have prices been moving?
Yeah.
The blue line is how much of a kicker do you get for being higher quality? Better location, more square feet, newer building.
Okay.
And what we see is when the foreign buyer tax came in around mid-2016, there was a big reward to quality for whatever reason.
Okay.
The market liked quality. You got a big premium for better product. By late 2018, we were at like an all-time low, at least since 2015, in the premium for quality.
Interesting.
So that suggests to me that prior to 2016, it was the high end of the market driving the train. And then, we had a bunch of tax interventions that were unfriendly to the top, empty homes, speculation. The empty homes are concentrated in Cole Harbor and Shaughnessy, so that probably hits the top of the market more. Speculation tax, not sure. We don't have any data on who's paying that, but you might again think that's a little top heavy. Stress test 2, you would think would be bottom heavy. So the market was probably being driven by those first time buyers, which is what you see with the decline in the blue. When that starts to kick in, now everything's slow.
Okay.
Now, the other thing that's been happening that I think is just going to be absolutely fascinating to watch, and I'd be interested in your thoughts, is what I like to call the looming condo inventory Sabaka spectacle or dog show, or SS could be the initials for another, something show. We started building a lot of condos, not surprisingly, when you saw those rising prices. The incentive to turn dirt into building is bigger than it ever was, starting 16 to 18. And it happened. A lot of buildings getting built, city councils collecting a lot of community amenity contributions, doing zoning for dollars. That product only recently started hitting the market, and I don't think we've hit the peak of product hitting the market. Now, what's interesting about the condo run-up is you wonder if there weren't people looking to get out of foreign buyer tax, whatever, by buying pre-sale units. Because a pre-sale purchase is not taxed under foreign buyer, doesn't pay the school tax, anything until the building's complete. So if I'm somebody who wants to
this is an opportunity to speculate.
You have to believe it. Now, the development community and all the data, these finished buildings, it's not like we're seeing big spikes in foreign buyer tax. So it's a thought. I don't have any good data on this, but how could it be that you have lots of people, apparently up to 17% of the market in mid-2016, saying, I'm sick of this guy over here, this dictator stealing my money. I'm going to buy a house in West Van. Then you have the pre-sale market explode. You have to think some of that was those people who didn't want to pay foreign buyer tax but did want exposure to the Vancouver real estate market. Why not buy in a pre-sale, wait 2 years, you're exposed to the market for 2 years.
Sure.
Assign your pre-sale unit to somebody else, maybe totally tax-free. If I'm in Zurich, do I really have to pay, who do I have to pay tax on the pre-sale to? I think the rules have been tightened now. You would have to pay. But the tax is limited, and now I can roll over my position again, and I'll never pay the foreign buyer tax.
Yeah, because there's no withholding tax when you sell.
Yeah. I don't know what they're doing now. I think it's harder to get away from a capital gain should you be so blessed as to have a capital gain. But at the beginning in 2016, I don't think there was any such thing. So you had to think that game was getting played. But the music stops eventually. In a period where there's a lot of pre-sale activity, some people say, well, those rising prices for pre-sale units just make everything more expensive because, the locals can only buy existing product. They're chased out of the pre-sale. But when the pre-sales get finished and those net buyers become net sellers, what happens?
Sure.
And I think we're only starting to see that now. I don't know this will happen.
This could be very interesting.
Well, that's the condo inventory not so great show that I think could be a very interesting story for the next couple of years. Not a certainty. I think a lot of people probably bought these things hoping to be landlords. So we'll see a bit of rental inventory come on.
Yeah.
And, rents will continue to slow down, which is great. It might be these were kids living in their parents' basements. They're going to be new demand. They might be immigrants who didn't have a housing unit before. So it's certainly a world in which all this condo inventory stays absorbed. It was all pre-sold, and it stays absorbed.
Maybe.
But I think there's another world in which we get a bunch of rental product on, but we also see a lot of people trying to get out prior to completion. So it'll be very interesting to watch that space.
It will be interesting. Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, bottom line is once the property is completed, now these taxes start to kick in.
Well, and that's where
there's the cost of carrying it. I mean, when there's cost of carrying real estate regardless, but you have these additional costs that really have to be factored in once the place can be occupied.
Well, that's right. And
especially in Vancouver.
And then the question is, if somebody from overseas wants to overpay massively and pay $3,000 a square foot for a unit that's going to wind up being dark, 500 square feet with peeling laminate and sell for $1 million once it's finished, is that a bad thing? What's the loss? Essentially, they're acting as financiers for development. They're on the supply side, and if they never use the completed building, and they're not going to let it sit empty with the empty homes tax, why is this something we despise? And yet, if you did a survey of is it a good thing if somebody from outside invests in a pre-sale unit with the sole intention of flipping it prior to completion, that ruthlessness that an economist, an experienced business guy has that says, look, let's just look at what the bottom line impact is. I think people are disgusted by that. And so if the impact of all these new completions is lower prices, I don't think there will be any appreciation that all this condo construction financed possibly by flippers, and there's domestic flippers too. A lot of people buy into these units just for the speculative value. It's not a bad thing to speculate in construction. That's what developers do, and that's what effectively lenders do.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for whatever... And the other side of that is pre-sale. I mean, do you really think a first-time buyer ought to get into the market by buying a pre-sale building where they have no idea what the quality is going to be when it's complete? You're reading a contract with a gun to your head that you don't understand. I don't think that's a great way for people to get into the market. I think that is a market for sharks, and as long as they're out once the building's finished.
Yeah. Those are some great points, Tom. And, one of the things that I know Andrew Weaver, I brought his name up earlier, but he's been quite vocal about is he actually wants to ban foreign ownership altogether in BC. He keeps using the reference that New Zealand has done this. And I think there could be very serious unintended consequences from this because when you discourage complete ban by foreigners, you're losing out on some potential tax revenue that really will have that tax revenue today has really no impact on the affordability issue. So then this example you just gave, I think, is a good example of that.
Yeah, there's foreign and there's foreign. So first of all, Andrew Weaver's a brilliant guy. We've both met him, and he's an extremely accomplished scientist, brilliant guy, and he's not a racist.
I don't agree with everything he says, but I agree with most he says. But he's there's some things like that I just think, I don't know. I question whether that's a good call.
Well, the use of foreign, I'm going to say it, I don't think it's racist, but what I always say is if I was a racist, I would love a foreign buyer tax or a foreign buyer ban. And it makes me uncomfortable to use nationality, just at the level of I just don't think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
That said, there's an economic issue as well, which is, I think the last time I looked at the foreign buyer tax data, and it's been a while, it was something like 2% of the market. Going from 2% to 0% of the market is not going to have a giant impact on affordability, especially to the extent that 2% is concentrated at the high end. But it could have an adverse impact on taxes. And then you ask yourself, how bad is it if some guy from Texas wants to have a place in Cole Harbor? Yeah, they are taking a unit out of supply in an area with scarce supply, and that is a cost, and there should be a tax. But if they're going to pay $100,000 a year in taxes all in,
right?
It's not $100,000 bad because $20,000 a year gets you an affordability rental in the suburbs, or $25,000.
Exactly.
So $100,000 you're housing 4 families at the cost of 1 unit. There is a point at which the tax is great enough that this is a desirable rather than an undesirable thing. So I think a ban, let's not get hung up on nationality for ethics' sakes. 2, it's not going to have much impact on prices. 3, let's embrace foreign investment. And the other side, of course, is I don't think most people, even prior to the speculation tax, aimed to leave the units empty. I think some did. And the speculation tax now, what the speculation tax says is, well, you go ahead and buy that unit, Mr. Texan, but you're going to have to rent it out. What's the harm in that? We like landlords. We like if a Canadian real estate investment trust buys apartments or builds apartments, we think that's great. It's not very different if somebody from overseas buys a unit to rent it out, which with the empty homes and speculation tax is going to be, you'd have to think, the end result, unless they want to cough up thousands of dollars in taxes.
Absolutely. Yeah. These are great. This is what I love. I'm so glad you came on the show, Tom. Let's talk about some of the other issues.
Sure.
One of the things that's come up recently, and I don't know if we can switch gears here to the federal policy, but one of the things that the Liberal government has just announced in their latest budget is they want to help first-time home buyers now with this equity component. This I think they're up to 10% of the value of the house or something like that.
5 for existing units, 10 for new.
Yeah. Can you talk about this a little bit at all?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was very critical when the last provincial government put in the BC Home Partnership Program.
That was the sort of second mortgage program, effectively.
So if you're going to get
I know
insured
Ebby was
loan
really
these days,
against that, and I think they shut it down almost right.
Well, the best thing about it was nobody took it up, and the reason.
Okay.
There is an argument, by the way, and let me take a big picture here, if I might, for a moment.
Yeah.
So we're in a market where R minus G is spectacularly low. What do I mean by R minus G? Take some appropriate rate of return, start with the riskless rate. So a 10-year Government of Canada bond is paying, what, 169 today, 1.7?
It's sub 2 for sure.
Well, sub 2.
Yeah.
Rents are not allowed. The government is so worried about rising rents, and I think this was a mistake. They capped growth instead of at 4% at 2%.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Because they think the market's growing at more than 2%. I think
they're totally discouraging people from wanting to be landlords.
Rent control is not something economists tend to like. I think what we had before with 2% above CPI was probably pretty workable.
Yeah.
But going from 4 to 2, I just don't see the case that you can't pay a 2% real bump in rents, that people ought to be protected from that, especially on new product. But we'll put that aside for the moment.
We'll come back to that, though, because you're originally from New York.
I am.
And doesn't New York have some pretty serious rent controls?
It does, but it hasn't applied generally to new units. So, for example, rents are falling in New York because of new supply, where new units are exempted. You're protecting people in old existing buildings under the old rules.
I see.
I think rent control in New York actually gets a bad rap. I was actually named as an undergrad the worst article of the year by the right-wing student newspaper. I wrote something at the time. I was further left than I am today, saying, this economics textbook is totally baloney because of their treatment of rent control, it was too simplistic because they treat it as a price ceiling, and when you have to embrace nuance when you think about policy.
We're going to come back in a minute with Tom Davidoff. One of the things I want to talk, because you are from New York and an American, and we went through the financial crisis, a housing crisis.
Yeah.
The United States was really hit hard. Canada was a little bit, but didn't experience the same kind of real estate demise that the U.S. saw, and there's a lot of people who believe that it's because of these stricter rules we have in Canada. But I'd love to get your thoughts on, are we at risk here in Canada of seeing something like this happen? So we're going to come back with Tom Davidoff in a minute, and we'll talk about that.
Fantastic.
Thanks. Okay, we're back here with Tom Davidoff. Tom, we're going to switch gears for a minute and talk about the financial crisis that occurred in 2008, 2009. And this massive crash of real estate prices in the United States. We didn't see it so badly in Canada. And just curious to know, what are your thoughts? Do you think that we could be subject to something like this in Canada near term or at some point in the future?
Well, it's interesting. So the U.S., first of all, now we have a generation below us who didn't experience. It used to be I'd teach. Well, you remember the U.S. housing crisis. My undergrads, who are 20 today, were 8 years old in 2007.
Right.
So
time goes fast, huh?
Yeah.
It seems like just yesterday, but
obviously this is a big moment in our lives. And just to give the broad brush of it, you had this expansion in non-prime lending in the U.S. In Canada, the banks dominate the scene, but everybody knows there's these other lenders out there, and they're growing with the stress test, who'll charge higher interest rates for people who can't get a so-called conforming loan. And that got very big in the States. It got to be, not 10% of the market, 50% of the market was non-prime. If you look at where...
Was it really 50%?
Yeah. Oh. And if you look at where prices boomed and busted, a lot of observers missed this because people saw San Francisco and Boston. They were the first markets to go. And you say, it's like Vancouver. It's hard to build. Everybody wants to live there.
Yeah.
And so you're going to get a boom, but you might get a bust. The big boom and bust, the crazy thing, was in easily supplied markets. Las Vegas, Phoenix, Modesto, California, which is California, but not the part people love. And, good produce, but, not the same supply constraints. And so it was minority neighborhoods, unfortunately, typically, where people had been locked out of home ownership, both by bias from banks and just difficulty assembling a down payment because of the unfortunate correlation in the states between wealth, income, and ethnic background. And you had these booms fed by subprime lending where people who had not been able to buy before got into the market. And that first-time buyer, people who couldn't get in and now can, a colleague of mine, Francois Artalo-Magne and Sven Rady, years ago, when I was in grad school, they developed a model that points out what every realtor knows, that first-time buyer is a big part of movements in prices. When they have access to credit, that can really move things, even though a lot of supply was coming on. Well, you're building plenty of houses for people who really can't afford these loans. Eventually, things are going to go wrong, and they did. Prices fell below construction cost instead of twice construction cost. You had a lot of people not able to make the payments on their mortgage or strategically default, whatever it was. And the problem was, that drop in housing prices would have been manageable in an economy like the U.S. Housing's not everything, and it wasn't by any means every house. So that was okay. That's like billions of dollars lost, which is fine. Not great, but fine. What was not fine was the banks, important financial institutions, had these derivative securities on the mortgage loans. So, you would take the loans and stratify order of payments. You'd take the low payments. You try to squeeze some AAA out of even the junky stuff by tranching that. Everybody's seen The Big Short.
Yeah.
The balance sheets of banks, they were very opaque. You might want to look at, what was it, Repo 101? Repo 105. Have you heard of this?
No.
Okay, so it wasn't Lehman. It was one of the banks that eventually went bad. It might have been Lehman. It was a lot like what Enron would do. At the end of the quarter, they would do a repurchase agreement with their junky assets where they would borrow against them. And if you borrowed 105% loan to value, Repo 105, that counted as a sale. So you no longer owned the asset, but you'd borrowed it 105%. The reporting period's done. Nobody knows it's on your books. The first day of the next reporting period, you buy the stuff back.
Yeah.
You hope.
Yeah.
And so you hide it from your balance sheet, even though it's like multiplicative risk.
It's called window dressing.
Yeah.
That's what they call it. I mean, I see it in my own work.
So people didn't understand the securities, and they didn't understand banks' exposures to them, and stuff froze up. So banks could no longer, pass the tests required to keep being operational. People didn't trust counterparties in markets, and so the economy just really seized up for a while.
Yeah.
And housing, which is a big part of the economy, was dead. Of course, you were overbuilt. There wasn't going to be construction. Canada, do we have that problem potentially? I mean, one thing you look at is where are the risky loans? And there were ninja loans to people from overseas for high value properties. I'm guessing the banks are somewhat exposed to those. I don't think it's probably a big part of them. Home builders, people may be in the midst of stuff that's pre-sold, but the pre-sales could fall apart. Is that a lot for the lenders, enough to really have a macro consequence? Vancouver's housing market going bad is not enough to drag down Canada. It's terrible for Vancouver, but a really just giant macro disaster. The drive to qualify stuff, maybe you do worry about. Maybe these insured loans, most of the losses to the government, CMHC, but you need to tell a story where the banks themselves get into trouble. But I talked about that condo scenario. I could believe you're going to have, people were paying 125% of market to buy into pre-sale buildings. And if the market falls 30%, you have people down 40, 50% with 20% down payments who can't get loans, want to get out. There's a world in which we have quite a disaster here. Macro consequences,
not likely.
I don't know. I don't know enough about where stuff gets hidden on balance sheets, but my suspicion is that's not as likely, but we'll see.
It seems like a lot of these mortgage rules that have been just coming out year after year has probably helped address this issue. I mean, on one hand, as we were talking offline for a moment, I'm very much almost like a libertarian. I'm not a big fan of big government. I love free market, but at the same time, I believe there is a value of having government implement these kind of rules to stabilize a society, so we don't go into complete anarchy.
The government provides CMHC is a government entity. I mean, if non-CMHC insured high loan to value loans are such a great idea, the private market is free to go and make those loans.
Sure.
So the government's saying, hey, the taxpayer's on the hook. We want to dial back. I don't have a big problem with that. Now, one last point to look at as an indicator is Genworth stock, because CMHC is on the hook for defaults, but they're a crown corporation, so it's hard to know what the market makes of that business. Except Genworth is a publicly traded company that's in the same business.
Sure.
And what I always found interesting is look at their price-earnings ratio. That's the New York Stock Exchange. So you want a MIC, it's a TSE stock. There you go. TSE, sorry.
TSX, there it goes,
So let's look at their price earnings. What are they, 8.35? I think their U.S. counterparts, Radian and Magic, are more like 14%.
Okay.
So it's been funny to watch, and Genworth's been there all through the cycle. Like people paying,
long time.
You're buying a condo in Vancouver, and the price to earnings is like 50, right? Your net income divided by price is 2%. Here it's 8%.
Yeah.
What's up with that? On the one hand, people love the real estate market. On the other hand, Genworth hasn't been that hot. It hasn't suffered that much recently. If that PE gets to zero, that's the indicator that people think this market's screwed. But what's interesting about the stress test is it may be bad for property values, But the loans that Genworth has been insuring in CMHC the last couple of years, people pointed this out to me, they're really high quality loans because people have to satisfy the stress test.
Yeah.
So the likelihood of them getting really clobbered, they're making fairly safe loans, and the other stuff has 2 years of appreciation behind it. So there'd have to be a real catastrophe before we see losses to them.
Yeah. The feedback I get from a lot of the Treasury people that I work with on a day-to-day basis is that the one difficulty with all these new regulations is there's just a lot less CMHC insured mortgages to fund in the first place. And it's a real challenge that I think it's one of the reasons why, even though we've seen a rise in interest rates, Canadian bank stock prices haven't really done that well.
No.
Normally they, when rates are going up, they skyrocket, especially you would have thought so in the last couple of years. I mean, they've done well, but they haven't done fantastic. And one of the things I keep hearing is that the pool of securitization. So this is the bundling, like you described earlier, the bundling of CMHC insured mortgages to sell off into the bond market, and basically it's a way of the banks of funding their capital, funding their balance sheet. Go ahead.
They transform risky mortgages into cash-like securities.
That's right.
It's just a great business for them.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. But there's a lot less because, first of all, to get a CMHC insured mortgage, if your house value or your condo value exceeds $1 million, it immediately is disqualified.
That's right.
Well, that pretty much takes out all of Vancouver and all of Toronto.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a big part of the market. I want to just circle back to kind of wrap this up. I want to talk about another not criticism, I could say, but sort of a hot topic right now. I guess you could call it a criticism by the BC Liberal government. Although I'd argue that anything that they are looking for right now is a way of just trying to throw mud at the BC NDP.
They're the opposition.
They're the opposition. That's what they're supposed to do. That's their job. But they're really critical right now of the fact that the BC NDP, through this sort of most recent legislation, is they're now basically going to dive into beneficial ownership and requiring to get a lot of information around taxes and social insurance number and whatnot for every single home owned in British Columbia. And again, going back to that, my constant challenge between being a guy who loves free market and small government, combined with making sure we have good policies. In order to have good policies, you have to have good data.
Yeah.
And so if you look at your housing affordability fund, in order to ever implement that in verbatim, you need to know what people have paid in taxes and what they are paying in taxes. In order to do that, you have to have this data. You have any thoughts about the way in which the provincial government today is now approaching this and trying to go into and saying, okay, we don't have an alternative agenda here. We are truly just wanting to know who owns. I mean, that's what they state. And of course, the Liberals say, no, there's some other hidden agenda here. But we want to know, who owns this property. Any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question. Off the top of my head, the idea that, oh my God, the government's going to have your social insurance number, I think they already have it.
The federal does.
The feds do. The province, I don't know if the Ministry of Finance knows my SIN.
Yeah.
I just don't. I honestly don't know.
Well, you don't file a BC tax return. You file a federal
but the finance ministry gets the money.
They get the money,
share.
but they don't necessarily
do they
get all
see
the
the
data.
return. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe
I don't know either.
Yeah. The beneficial ownership registry, I think, has a lot going for it.
I do too.
Tax avoidance being the big one. How do you have a foreign buyer tax without it? Here's a game I don't understand how people haven't played, which is I'm a realtor. If you're from Taiwan and you want to buy a place in Vancouver, what I can't do is form a corporation that I know you're going to buy. Right, the corporation now owns the property. I sell you the corporation. That's tax evasion. I'm in trouble. However, if I don't know who you are, but I think people like you guys are going to be foreign buyers for a property. If I'm a realtor, I think I can form a numbered corporation, buy the property, hold it for a little while, and then look to flip to whoever, sell the corporation. That's not a property transfer, and I'm out of the foreign buyer tax in that game.
Absolutely.
So if you don't have beneficial ownership, I don't see how you can enforce foreign buyer tax. Speculation tax, you have to show a tax return. Could you black out your SIN? I don't know if that would be enforceable otherwise. So certainly in the case of an audit, I think eventually the SIN is going to have to come up. I respect privacy concerns. I've switched from Android to an iPhone because I don't want Google. I don't have any specific concern, but I just, I'm not sure I want them to see everything I do. So I understand the concern. I don't know how, just like you say, there is a tension. I don't know how you do the enforcement without the SIN eventually coming up. And I think this beneficial ownership registry, is terrific. I guess one option, though, I should say, is under any regime, maybe you always preserve I'm going to pay the tax because I want the privacy. Here's my numbered corp. I'm not going to tell you who owns it.
That's a great solution. That's simple. That's simple.
And again, you just come up with a dollar figure where the government says, all right, this property's off the market, we think, and there's a cost to that, but there's a number.
Sure.
Although then you get to money laundering and maybe you're murdering people and drugs. I don't know.
Maybe, but at least if you're a money laundering or you're a drug dealer and you're paying their taxes, at least you're now at least you're a contributing member of society in a positive way as opposed to just a negative way.
I think I'm gonna start saying I'm in the realm of I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I do like. Here's the thing about beneficial ownership. Look, I work in the financial markets, and for me to have a regular, plain vanilla Canadian who's born and raised in this country open up an education account, I have, short of getting a blood sample. Yeah. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of information I have to get. Yet in real estate, there's virtually no AML, anti-money laundering requirements at all. There's almost no terrorist financing requirements at all. It's mind-blowing to me. And so to me, I support the idea of at a minimum beneficial ownership. Also because, look, I live in a neighborhood over in West Point Grey that has a lot of these empty homes because I walk around, I see them. The lights are never on. And while they may never be affordable homes, I do believe that taxing these homes is a good idea because I'm pretty sure if they're empty and they're owned by foreign buyers, they're probably not contributing to the tax system in Canada and BC. But the thing is, you don't know until you have a bit. So like when I've heard people for years saying, well, the reason the prices have risen so much in Vancouver is because of all the foreign buyers. I could make the argument, a very strong argument, well, actually it's because of cheap credit. Yeah. Because we go back to that graph we were talking about. The cost of borrowing money has been so cheap for so long. I mean, Vancouver's not the only market. The prices have risen, right? And it isn't, and there isn't. I mean, prices have risen in many communities, many of which don't have a lot of foreign owners. And so until you know the data, you can't really make a solid claim.
That was going back. That was really part of the idea was, hey, everybody's saying it's those guys from overseas. Maybe. Well, other people said, no, it's not at all. Well, let's get some data and figure this out. So, the role of people not making a living in the homes, you won't know until you collect the data. And in fact, as I go back to what our original document said, we said, hey, this is an important side benefit, is we're going to get an idea of the magnitude. If you're not getting any revenue out of this, everybody turns out it's an owner-occupier paying income tax or is a landlord. You move on to the next policy, probably on the supply side.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, you're associate professor at the Sauder School of Business at UBC. Yep. You're on social media. What is your Twitter handle?
At Tom Davidoff.
At Tom Davidoff.
At Tom Davidoff, or you can find some of my research at blogs.ubc.ca/Davidoff.
Okay. And Davidoff spelled?
Like the cigars. Like David then off. Davidoff. Okay.
Do you like cigars?
No.
Okay.
No. And I might be related. I know the guys, I think he might even be Odessa, but he's definitely Ukrainian, which is where the Davidoffs were from at some point way back. But haven't seen a dime of royalties.
Yeah, not yet. Well, there's your Twitter handle there, Tom Davidoff. And looks like there's a link to your blogs on there as well. So that's great. Tom, it's been great having you on the show today.
A real treat.
I'd love to have you come back maybe in the fall to do another recap and talk about, I'm sure there'll be some changes that we would want to discuss.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming in today.
Real
it's been
pleasure.
Great to have you here. Thanks, Tom.
Welcome to Coastal Front. Join us each week as we sit down with the movers and shakers of Vancouver to discuss stories of business, politics, accomplishment, and failure. Our aim is to keep you dialed into what matters most in our city. Now, here's your host, Andrew Johns.